For centuries, Europe deliberately erased an African empire so powerful it threatened their version of history. An empire with universities when Europe was burning books. An empire with written chronicles, diplomatic letters, and royal decrees, documents that exist today, sitting in archives most people will never be told about. So why was this civilization removed from textbooks, stripped from museums, and buried beneath centuries of silence? Because the records proved something Europe couldn't allow the world to believe, that African kingdoms were not primitive, not isolated, and not waiting to be civilized. They were rivals. And the reason for this erasure was more dangerous than war. It was ideological. It was systematic. It was necessary for the story Europe wanted to tell about itself. So what kind of African empire terrified Europe enough to make it disappear? Between the 11th and 15th centuries, while much of medieval Europe struggled with feudal fragmentation and localized power, a vast empire rose in southeastern Africa. It was called Great Zimbabwe. At its height, this empire controlled trade routes stretching from the Zambezi River to the Indian Ocean coast. Its capital city housed an estimated 18,000 people, larger than medieval London at the time. The empire's influence extended across modern-day Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and parts of Botswana and South Africa. This wasn't a scattered collection of villages. It was a centralized state with sophisticated governance, a complex social hierarchy, and an economy built on gold, ivory, and cattle. The heart of the empire was a stone city, massive granite walls, some over 30 feet high, built without mortar. Precision-cut stones fitted so tightly together that even today, you can't slide a blade between them. But this prosperity was not accidental. Great Zimbabwe sat at the center of a vast trade network. Gold mined from the surrounding highlands flowed through the empire to Swahili port cities like Kilwa and Sofala, then onward to Arabia, Persia, India, and China. Archaeologists have found Chinese porcelain, Persian glass beads, and Arabian coins in the ruins, proof of Great Zimbabwe's integration into global commerce. The empire had a ruling class, a merchant class, artisans, miners, and farmers. It had craft specialization, centralized tax collection, and monumental public architecture that required coordinated labor and planning across generations. And outsiders who visited were stunned by what they saw. Arab and Swahili merchants wrote of the kingdom's wealth. Portuguese explorers in the early 16th century, arriving just as the empire was declining, documented stories of a great stone city ruled by a powerful king, surrounded by vassals and tributaries. Foreign chroniclers described a land of abundance, order, and gold. Their accounts still exist. They're in libraries, in archives, in translated manuscripts. So why have most people never heard of it? Evidence about this great empire was never missing. It was just ignored. Arab geographer al-Masudi wrote about the gold-rich kingdoms of southeastern Africa as early as the 10th century. By the 12th century, the geographer al-Idrisi documented trade routes linking the interior of Africa to the Swahili coast, describing prosperous kingdoms dealing in gold and ivory. In the early 1500s, Portuguese explorer João de Barros recorded accounts of a massive stone fortress inland from Sofala, a structure so impressive that local traders spoke of it with reverence. He wrote of a kingdom called Zimbabwe, ruled by a powerful sovereign who controlled the gold trade. Another Portuguese chronicler, Diogo de Alcacova, documented in 1506 that the fortress was built of stones of marvelous size, and there appears to be no mortar joining them. These weren't legends. They were eyewitness accounts, trade records, diplomatic correspondence. Maps drawn by Arab and later Portuguese cartographers marked the region as a center of commerce. Chinese porcelain shards, Persian beads, and Indian textiles unearthed from Great Zimbabwe's ruins match the exact periods during which these trade networks were documented. The archaeological evidence is undeniable. The historical records corroborate it. The physical ruins still stand today. What these records described contradicted everything Europe wanted to believe. Because by the time European colonial powers arrived in full force in the 19th century, they had already constructed a narrative. Africa was a dark continent, untouched by civilization, waiting to be enlightened by European intervention. An advanced African empire with stone architecture, international trade, and centralized governance didn't fit that story. And that contradiction would soon become a problem. When British colonizers encountered the ruins of Great Zimbabwe in the late 1800s, they were confronted with undeniable proof of African achievement. But rather than acknowledge it, they did something else. They rewrote it. European archaeologists and scholars began circulating theories that the ruins must have been built by Phoenicians, Arabs, or even the biblical Queen of Sheba, anyone but the African people living there. Early records that had documented an African empire were reclassified as native folklore. Accounts from Arab and Portuguese sources were downplayed or selectively edited. The stones themselves were studied not to understand who built them, but to prove they couldn't have been built by Africans. Maps were redrawn, textbooks were edited, museum labels were carefully worded, because acknowledging this empire would have forced Europe to rewrite its entire narrative. And that was a threat far more dangerous than any army. To understand why Great Zimbabwe was erased, you have to understand what Europe was building in the 19th century. Not just colonies, not just empires, an ideology. By the 1800s, European powers had divided Africa among themselves at the Berlin Conference. They justified this conquest with a single powerful narrative. Africans were primitive, incapable of self-governance, and in need of European civilization. This wasn't just political convenience, it was foundational to European identity. The entire moral framework of colonialism rested on the belief that Europe was bringing progress to a continent that had none. That Africa had no history worth remembering, no achievements worth studying, no civilizations worth acknowledging. This narrative wasn't accidental. It was constructed deliberately in universities, in museums, in textbooks, and in public discourse. It became the lens through which the entire world viewed Africa. And then there was Great Zimbabwe, a stone city built without European influence. An empire that traded internationally centuries before European contact. A civilization with governance, wealth, and architectural sophistication that rivaled medieval Europe. This was not just inconvenient, it was existential. Because if Africans had built empires, governed themselves, and thrived without Europe, then what justified European rule? If Africans had their own history of achievement, then the entire premise of the civilizing mission collapsed. This was not just history, it was power, and power does not tolerate contradictions. So, European scholars, archaeologists, and colonial administrators were faced with a choice: acknowledge the truth and dismantle the ideological foundation of their empire, or suppress the truth and maintain control. They could admit that Great Zimbabwe was built by the Shona people, the ancestors of those they were colonizing, and accept that Africans were capable of everything Europeans claimed they were not. Or they could protect the narrative, rewrite the evidence, attribute the ruins to anyone but Africans, bury the records, control the story. Europe was at a decision point between truth and dominance, and Europe made its choice. You see, deleting such history didn't happen overnight. It happened methodically, institutionally, and with academic authority. In 1871, when German explorer Karl Mauch became one of the first Europeans to study the Great Zimbabwe ruins extensively, he was confronted with an architectural marvel that defied every assumption he held about Africa. His conclusion? The ruins must have been built by a civilized race. He theorized they were constructed by Phoenicians. Some suggested King Solomon's miners. Others claimed it was the Queen of Sheba's lost palace. One British archaeologist even proposed it was a replica of Solomon's temple, built by ancient Semitic peoples who had migrated south. Not a single mainstream European scholar was willing to entertain the obvious, that the Shona people, whose descendants still lived in the region, had built it themselves. And this wasn't just one man's opinion, it became an official policy. In 1905, the British South Africa Company, which controlled the region, appointed Richard Hall as the curator of the Great Zimbabwe site. Hall was tasked with excavating and preserving the ruins. Instead, he did the opposite. He removed what he called the filth and decadence of the Kafir occupation, layers of African artifacts that proved continuous habitation by the Shona people. He discarded beads, pottery, tools, and anything that connected the site to its African builders. He wasn't preserving history. He was destroying evidence. What wasn't destroyed was rebranded. The region itself was renamed. The colony became Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes, the British imperialist, erasing even the linguistic memory of Zimbabwe, the Shona word for Great Stone House. In schools across the British Empire, Great Zimbabwe was either omitted entirely or presented as a mystery, an enigma built by some lost non-African civilization. Oral histories passed down through generations of Shona elders were dismissed as myths and folklore, unworthy of scholarly attention. When African voices tried to claim their own heritage, they were told they were mistaken, that they didn't understand their own past, and what couldn't be rebranded was silenced. Academic journals rejected papers that proposed African origins. Museums displayed artifacts with vague labels that avoided attributing them to indigenous builders. Textbooks were written and rewritten, each edition further distancing Great Zimbabwe from African achievement. Colonial administrators understood something crucial. If you control education, you control memory. And if you control memory, you control identity. Behind closed doors, decisions were made about what would be taught, what would be published, and what would be locked away in archives where only select scholars had access. The records from Arab traders, marginalized as biased or unreliable, the Portuguese accounts, selectively quoted or ignored, the archaeological evidence, manipulated to fit predetermined conclusions. This wasn't ignorance, it was deliberate. But erasing history is never perfect, because erasing stone is an impossible feat. Despite decades of deliberate destruction and narrative control, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe remained. 30-foot walls of precisely cut granite, elaborate stone towers, complex drainage systems, architectural sophistication that couldn't be explained away. And slowly, the truth began to resurface. In the 1920s and 30s, a new generation of archaeologists, some African, some European, began challenging the established narrative. Gertrude Catton Thompson, a British archaeologist, conducted systematic excavations in 1929 and reached an undeniable conclusion. Great Zimbabwe was built by indigenous African people. Her findings were published, her methods were rigorous, her evidence was conclusive, and she was attacked for it. European scholars dismissed her work as politically motivated. Colonial authorities minimized her findings. Academic institutions that had built careers on the foreign builder theory refused to accept her conclusions, but the evidence kept mounting. Radiocarbon dating in the 1950s confirmed that Great Zimbabwe was built between the 11th and 15th centuries, precisely when the Shona people dominated the region. Pottery styles, tool designs, and architectural techniques all matched known Shona cultural patterns. Oral histories that had been dismissed as folklore suddenly aligned perfectly with archaeological timelines. Shona elders had been right all along. Their ancestors had built the stone city. Every discovery reopened wounds history tried to seal. Foreign archives yielded more proof. Researchers uncovered the original Portuguese accounts, not the sanitized versions that had circulated, but the complete documents describing an African kingdom of immense power and wealth. Arab trading records were re-examined. The same chronicles that European scholars had once used to prove Africa's engagement in global trade were now undeniable evidence of Great Zimbabwe's economic sophistication. Even Chinese trade records mentioned the gold-rich kingdoms of southeastern Africa, corresponding to the exact period of Great Zimbabwe's dominance. The evidence was everywhere, in museums, archives, and the land itself. But resistance remained. When Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980 and reclaimed its name from Rhodesia, it wasn't just a political act. It was a historical reclamation. The new nation chose Zimbabwe deliberately, asserting ownership of a heritage that had been stolen. And even then, some Western scholars resisted. Textbooks took decades to change. Museum exhibits were slow to update. The narrative of African inferiority had become so embedded in global consciousness that correcting it felt like a battle against inertia itself. And not everyone wanted these truths exposed. Because acknowledging Great Zimbabwe means acknowledging that the entire framework used to justify colonialism was built on a lie. It means recognizing that African civilizations were systematically erased, not because they didn't exist, but because they existed too well. It means confronting the possibility that what we call history is often just the story the powerful chose to tell. And if that's true for Great Zimbabwe, if this empire was erased, how many others were too? You see, the thing about erasing people's history is you don't just remove facts from textbooks. You remove identity, confidence, legacy. You reshape how an entire continent sees itself and how the world sees them. For generations, African children were taught that their ancestors had no history worth studying. That civilization came from elsewhere. That anything of value on the continent was built by outsiders or introduced by colonizers. This wasn't education, it was psychological colonization. When young people grow up believing their heritage is one of backwardness, it shapes everything: ambition, self-worth, and the stories they tell about their own potential. Deleting Great Zimbabwe from history wasn't just an academic crime, it was a theft of inheritance. Because Great Zimbabwe represented proof, tangible, undeniable proof that Africans built empires, governed complex societies, engaged in international commerce, and created architectural marvels without European intervention. That proof could have changed everything. It could have altered the way African nations negotiated independence. It could have strengthened resistance to colonial narratives. It could have provided a foundation of pride and historical legitimacy when African nations were redefining themselves in the 20th century. Instead, that foundation was deliberately removed, and the consequences rippled outward. The world learned to see Africa as a place without history, a blank slate, a resource to be extracted, a problem to be solved by outsiders. This perception didn't just affect how Europeans viewed Africa. It affected international policy, economic development, humanitarian intervention, and global power dynamics. When a continent is viewed as historically inferior, it becomes easier to justify ongoing exploitation. When people are taught they have no legacy of achievement, they're less likely to demand recognition, reparations, or respect. Erased history doesn't disappear. It mutates. It becomes internalized shame. It becomes stereotypes that persist across generations. It becomes the invisible ceiling that determines who gets taken seriously in global conversations about economics, governance, and culture. And its consequences are still felt today. Even now, African innovations are frequently attributed to outside influence. African success stories are framed as exceptions. African history is compressed into slavery and colonization, as if nothing existed before or beyond European contact. Think about what was lost in the classrooms alone. Imagine an African student in the 1950s sitting in a colonial school, learning about the Roman Empire, the Greeks, the Renaissance, but never hearing that their own ancestors built stone cities and controlled gold trade routes that stretched across continents. Imagine the questions they never thought to ask about their own potential, because they were never given a mirror to their own history. Imagine the entrepreneurs, scientists, leaders, and artists who might have drawn inspiration from knowing their heritage included architectural genius and economic power, but were instead taught their history began with European arrival. This erasure didn't just rob the past, it robbed the future. The cost compounds across generations. Every child taught that Africa had no civilizations becomes an adult who accepts that narrative. Every teacher who never learned about Great Zimbabwe cannot pass that knowledge forward. Every policymaker who views Africa through the lens of historical inferiority makes decisions that reinforce that perception. The damage spreads like roots beneath the surface, invisible but structural. And perhaps the cruelest part is how the erasure made itself invisible. Most people don't even know what they're missing. They don't know to ask why Great Zimbabwe isn't in their textbooks, because they have never heard the name. They don't question why African history seems to start with colonization, because that's the only version they were given. The absence became normalized. The silence became background noise. And for over a century, one of humanity's great civilizations existed only in whispers, fragments, and the stubborn persistence of stone walls that refused to crumble. But here's what the architects of that erasure didn't account for. Truth has a way of resurfacing. So why now? Why, after more than a century of suppression, is the truth about Great Zimbabwe finally breaking through? Because the gatekeepers are losing control. For generations, history was written by a small group of institutions: universities, publishers, museums, colonial administrations. They decided what was worth remembering, what was worth teaching, what deserved to be called civilization. But the internet changed the game. Suddenly, African scholars could publish research without needing approval from European academic journals. Oral historians could share traditions that had been dismissed as myths. Independent researchers could access digitized archives and cross-reference sources that were once locked away. The monopoly on historical narrative began to crack, and people started asking questions. Why were African empires missing from world history curricula? Why did the story of human progress always seem to start in Europe or the Middle East? Why were the achievements of non-European civilizations consistently minimized or attributed to outside influence? These weren't new questions, but now they had a platform. Social media, documentaries, podcasts, and independent content creators began filling the gaps that traditional education left behind. The audience was ready, hungry even, for a more complete story. Because here's what's becoming clear. The erasure of Great Zimbabwe wasn't an accident of history. It was a choice. A deliberate, sustained effort to control the narrative of human achievement and justify systems of oppression. And once you see it in one place, you start seeing it everywhere. The question is no longer whether this empire existed. The evidence is overwhelming. The ruins still stand. The artifacts fill museums. The records exist in archives around the world. The question now is, why were you never taught about it? Why wasn't this in your history textbook? Why didn't your teacher mention it when discussing medieval civilizations? Why does the average person know about the Roman Empire, the Mayans, and ancient Egypt, but not Great Zimbabwe? The answer is uncomfortable, but necessary. Because the same forces that erased Great Zimbabwe are still active today. In what gets funded, what gets published, what gets prioritized in education, and whose voices are amplified in telling the human story. Reclaiming this history isn't just about the past, it's about correcting the present. It's about ensuring that African children grow up knowing their heritage includes architectural marvels and international trade empires. It's about dismantling the unconscious biases that still shape how the world views African capability and potential. It's about understanding that the story of civilization is far richer, more diverse, and more interconnected than we've been led to believe. And you, yes, you watching this, are part of that rediscovery. Every time you learn something that was kept from you, every time you question why certain histories were omitted, every time you share knowledge that challenges the dominant narrative, you're participating in the restoration of truth. This isn't passive consumption. This is active reclamation. Because history isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember, what we choose to pass on, what we refuse to let disappear. Great Zimbabwe was erased because acknowledging it would have undermined an entire system of power. But that system is weakening. The truth is returning, not because institutions decided to release it, but because people demanded it. And this erased empire was only one chapter in a much larger story. Dozens of empires, treaties, and historical events were deliberately suppressed, rewritten, or erased to serve colonial interests. Great Zimbabwe is just the beginning. In the next documentary, we uncover the treaty that shaped an entire continent, except it was built on a lie so complete, even the people who signed it were deceived. A colonial treaty that wasn't what it seemed, borders that were never meant to make sense, and consequences that are still unraveling today. If this story made you question what else you weren't taught, you won't want to miss what comes next.